Hey, it's Rachel with Journey Back Quilts, and today we're going to journey back to a traditional quilt block called Birds in Air. We're going to be taking some of those half square triangles we've been making in the last few lessons and put them together to make this block. Let's get started. To make this Birds in Air quilt block, you're going to need 3 half square triangles. Mine are measuring 3.5. You're going to need to cut 2 squares that are measuring 3 7/8. And yes, the 7/8 is important. Don't make it 4. 3 7/8, and then cut them on the diagonal. And then I cut out a 10 1/4 inch square and cut that in a diagonal. Now I am making 4 of these in this color and 4 in this color. So you can see they're going to be opposite each other. They're the same quilt block, but this I used the lighter for my little blocks, and here I'm using the darker color. To lay this out, I'm going to use my design board so that I can carry it right over to the machine. So for this one, I'm going to put the light squares going down. We're going to have 2 up in the corner and 1 underneath them, all going the same direction. Then we're going to take our little triangles and put those on the middle and the sides. Just like this. And then once we have that block together, we'll add our white strip, or you could also use these colored strips to do this, but for the Aunt Rachel's Quilt Star, we're going to be using these in. I'm going to use a white background. Okay, let's take this to the sewing machine and piece these together. So I'm going to take the first 2 at the top of my row and put them right sides together, matching up those raw edges, and sew them down at 1/4 inch. Then I'm going to go down to the second row, take my little triangle and 1 half square triangle and put those together. Now I like to keep the half square triangle going through the machine with the flat side first instead of the pointy side first, so that this doesn't accidentally flip over and get sewn down. So I'm just going to have this one on the bottom of this block to be able to go through the machine more smoothly. Okay. Go ahead and clip apart those connecting seams. And I'm going to put this second row back on my mat. And this first row, making sure it's going the right way, we can add that last little triangle to this row. So same thing. I don't want to start it this way because I may catch that little guy and make it look weird. So I'm going to flip it over, keeping those right sides together so I can keep an eye on that little tail. Okay, now we need to go press these 2 rows. We're going to press them opposite directions. So I'm going to press this one towards the half square triangle and these ones towards the little triangle on the outside. So let's go to the ironing board. So for this one, I'm going to have the little triangle on my mat so that I can push that seam over towards my half square triangle. And then this one we want to iron the opposite direction, so I'm going to go towards the little triangle this time. All the seams going that way. And this way, when we put our pieces together, our seams are going to nest, which will make those perfect points. So what I mean by nesting the seam is we're going to just lock those seams right next to each other. You can see that this seam here is going towards the right, and this seam here is going towards the left. So those seams are just going to lock right in place next to each other, which is going to keep the points of our half square triangles pointing together without cutting off their points. Okay, let's go to the sewing machine and put these two pieces together. So again, I'm just going to double check that those are nested. And anytime I have a block that I need to nest the seams, I just worry about the first one, and I don't worry about getting the raw edges perfect on this side, because occasionally your blocks may not match up, but you want that point to match up perfectly. We can always trim off the outside if needed, but we can't fix that middle point. So always focus on the points, getting them perfectly nested. Also notice that I'm starting, if my machine wants to go. Sometimes getting over those bulkier seams is tricky for your machine, especially if you need a new needle, which I probably do. But I'm starting on the easier side instead of on this. I'm letting the tail go last, just like I did before. And your seam should hit right in between those little V's that this block and that other piece created. Right here. Isn't that perfect? Okay, before we iron this, we can add the other piece. And real quick, look at your points and see how they're matching just perfectly. That's what you want to see. That's why we're nesting our seams. Okay, this last piece can get attached to this side here. Remember, if your fabric has a right and a wrong side, you want to put those right sides together. Because I'm using a solid, I don't have a right or wrong side, which makes it a little bit easier to just get them on there and not have to worry about that extra step. Again, your seam's going to hit right in between that little V coming right off of there. Okay, so now let's take this piece to the ironing board. And I'm just going to iron all of the seams going down towards that last point we just put on. Because we didn't open the seams on our half square triangles or on this step, it might be a little bumpy right here because there's so much fabric stacked there. If you have a clapper, it can help flatten that seam, or you can open all of your seams before you do this step to help ensure everything stays nice and flat. Same with this block, we're just going to be ironing it all going the same direction. Now, I did find it helpful to clip off my dog ears. Just take some scissors and clip those off so there's a little less fabric to maneuver around when we put our last piece on. Okay, let's go do that. Now this block is going to finish at 9.5 inches square. So our white piece is definitely a lot bigger than our blue piece is. I personally like it that way so that I can trim it up and I can move my blue piece around on it to get it just where I want it to be. Otherwise, if I cut it at, 9 7/8 or 10 inches, it just didn't have enough wiggle room for me to get it as perfect as I wanted it to. So I'm lining up those raw edges and we're going to sew this down at 1/4 inch seam. The one thing you want to be careful of is that we don't sew off our point. So right here where it makes an X to that point, that's exactly where our seam is going to hit, right in that X. X marks the spot. Okay, just sew a little bit and then readjust your fabric. Again, make sure that it is hitting right at the X. And then readjust your fabric if need be. All right, let's go iron this and square it up. I'm going to iron it towards the dark side, so I'm going to put my white down on the mat and then push those seams over there. Or you can open your seams if you would like. And look at those perfect points. That's exactly what we want to see. And now to square this up, we're going to do the same thing we did with our half square triangles, except that our blue is already the 9.5 that we need it to be. So we don't want to cut any more of that off if we can help it, because we want a 1/4 inch above all of those points, so that when we put the next block next to it, we're not going to sew over those points. So I'm going to put the diagonal on the diagonal of my block, but I'm going to line up the 9.5 inch with the raw edge here. And it looks really good. So I'm just going to trim off my white and my dog ear. And then rotate it. Again, it should be 9.5 on this side now that we just trimmed, and 9.5 on the bottom. And your diagonal should still be sitting right there. Now, the blocks that I made before, I found that it was straight right up to here, and then my block got kind of twisty. You can just maneuver your fabric around until it's lined up with that diagonal piece. But this one is coming out just perfect, of course. So I'm going to trim off that dog ear, trim off the excess white, and now we have a perfect 9.5 inch square birds in air block. Wasn't that fun? Pretty easy, isn't it? So for the next lesson, when we make the Aunt Rachel's star block, we need 4 in this color scheme and 4 in this color scheme. Whatever colors you're choosing, you want to have opposites of both. So you can see I have light blue in these 3 and dark blue in these 3. Okay? All right, one more bonus block to this video. We're going to be making a 9 patch with some of our half square triangles. So same kind of thing. We're just going to be making 4 of these 9 patch blocks, making 3 rows of 3. So I'm just going to start with my right hand side, sewing it to the middle, chain piecing these 3 sets. Or if you want to chain piece all of them, since we're making 4, you'll chain piece 12 of these, and then we'll add our last block on. The only thing to pay attention to is that your blocks are going the right direction. If you sew these 2 on and then flip them around, you don't want to accidentally sew it like this or like this. You want them to be all going the same direction. Okay? Let's go to the sewing machine and put these together. If you're having trouble getting through that first bulky seam because we're going through so many layers of fabric, use a scrap piece of fabric to sew through first. Let me show you what that means. So I have just a piece of scrap fabric here, and I'm just going to sew a line on it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just going to be trash after this. But this leader fabric is going to help keep those threads up above the machine where they may try to push the block down inside. So let's see if it sews even better. So I'm going to put these right sides together, match up the raw edges, lift my foot, and look, it goes seamlessly through there. No pun intended. Okay, and then I just leave my needle down. I'm going to raise my foot and put the next block under there. And this is how we can chain piece all of our blocks at the same time. It will save us time, money, and thread. Because we won't have to be pulling out the thread every single time we do one block, pull it out, cut it off. You'll be wasting, pieces of thread that are about this big to this big each time you do that. But chain piecing, you just waste that little teeny tiny bit of thread. Okay, and then I use my little handy dandy gizmo cutting thing here. And I'm just going to reuse my leader fabric, and I'm just going to re-sew on top of it, making a thready mess of it. I'm going to open up these blocks, but I haven't pressed them yet. And I'm going to add the third piece to them, making sure they're going the right direction. Match up those raw edges. Then we can chain piece these as well. Now that we have those all sewn, I'm going to clip apart the connecting threads and take these to the ironing board. So I just laid these back out so you can get a visual of how these seams are supposed to go. So we want the top and bottom seams to be going the same direction, and I'm going to iron them all going towards the left. The middle one we want to go the opposite direction so that we can nest those seams. So I'm just going to lift up this block and lay that seam over with my iron. And same with the second block. So this one pushed into here, and now this one's going to push into this. By raising the block up, you're letting the seam rest on the ironing board so that when the iron hits it, it's just pressing it over to that next block. Pretty easy, right? So this next one, we're going to go the same direction. I just skipped that middle row and we're going to go that same direction. Pressing it over, pressing it over. And I like to do it from the top of the fabric so that I can see that I pressed it all the way over and I didn't accidentally fold some fabric under. When you do it from the back, it's too easy to make a mistake, and look at how perfect those look. Now this one we want to go the opposite direction, but I'm just going to rotate the block and still go that same direction, but it's actually the opposite way. That way I don't have to make my arm do some kind of funky dance to try to get the iron going the right direction. Just remember to flip it back around. And now our seams are going to nest together. So we're going to work with these first two, and I'm just going to worry about this seam here getting nested first. So we're going to lock those seams in place, just like we did the birds and air block, and sew that down at 1/4 inch. Once I get past this point, then I'll stop sewing just right about here, and then I'll work with this fabric to get it nested and then keep sewing. All right, let's go to the sewing machine. I should have used my leader fabric. Okay, now that I've gone through that first nested seam, I'm going to stop here and just adjust this fabric, pushing or pulling. Sometimes I kind of push that up just to get it nested first, just to give me a little bit more leeway, and then I'll straighten it back out, keeping a hold of that seam so that it stays nested. Keep those seams down as it's sewing over them. And there we go. Okay, before we go to the ironing board, I'm going to put the last row on, but look at how great those are looking. So double check that your rows are going the right direction, all your blocks are pointing the right way. Right sides together. And I have it on the wrong one. So this was my top and this was my bottom, and I was trying to put those together, but they were going the same direction. So if yours are going the same direction, try the other side where they're probably going the opposite direction. Yes, that looks much better. Okay, nest those first 2 seams. I'm going to get my leader fabric so we don't have to wrestle with that stacked seam there. The other thing is, if it's nested, you can feel that it's nice and flat and smooth there. If they're on top of each other, you would be able to feel that it's kind of bulkier. So get those seams nested. Give it a little pet, make sure it's going the right way. And when you're first learning, you're going to feel like you need 8 arms to do this. But I promise you don't. You're going to be just fine. Just do a little at a time and actually let the foot and the needle be your 3rd arm. It can hold that fabric in place while you adjust everything. Having an extension table on your sewing machine is very helpful as well. This is just a little one that comes with the Brother machine, but it gives me so much more room to work with than if I just had the little tiny space here. And most machines come with one, or they're custom made fiberglass ones. So check those out. You can just do a Google search for them. They're really handy. Okay, let's go to the ironing board. Now for these seams, I am going to open them because there is so much fabric in the way here. So I'm just going to open it with my finger and use the nose of my iron to wiggle through that seam. Now when I get to another seam like this one, I may kind of lift the iron up to help keep that seam laying flat. That way I don't accidentally iron it going the opposite direction, undoing all the hard work I just did. Isn't that nice? I'm going to put my clapper on there. And then we'll do this seam. I like to double check my measurements just to make sure that I don't have any excess hanging over and that I'm not too short. Now if it's 1/8 of an inch short, that is okay. I can work with that and we'll still have enough fabric to sew through. But if it's shorter than that, then I need to check my seam allowance or maybe my ironing and just double check everything. So what I'm doing to make sure this is 9.5 inches square, which it looks really good so far, is I'm measuring this first block to 3.25 inches on both sides so that it's running all the way through the block this way and this way. Okay, and then I can see at the bottom I'm hitting 9.5 and 9.5 this way. So I'm just going to double check around the outside, making sure I don't have any excess fabric. And I have just a tiny bit right there in the middle and a tiny bit right there at the top. But not too bad. And there you made a 9-patch block out of your half square triangles. If you make 4 of these flying geese, and 4 of these flying geese will be ready for next week's lesson where we put them together to make the Aunt Rachel's quilt block. Great job! Hey, thanks so much for joining me in making this Birds in Air quilt block. I hope that you enjoyed it and that it inspired you to make your own quilt block. If you would like more tips, tricks, and tutorials, I invite you to join us in Journey Back Quilts Sewciety, a membership where you'll get a library full of video tutorials, plus discounts on products and services, a quilting community to connect with quilters from all over the world, and so much more. Next week, we're going to be putting these blocks together as well as the 9-patch blocks that we made here to make my favorite quilt block, Aunt Rachel's Quilt Star, of course. We'll see you next week.